I thought, figuratively speaking, I thought that we would say a bit more regarding the queries of can you actually enjoy, in a particular sense, anything that you must do? Can you actually learn from that which is instinctively required? That, along with, if you recall the wrap-up query of what for? Porque. For what purpose, to what ends, is the secondary world, amongst other things that we have covered. And a little bit that we didn't talk about last time was to realize that although the primary world and all the primary activities are, and let us call it pleasurable, to distinguish it between what we were trying to identify as being enjoyable, that all the primary activities are, without any doubt, pleasurable. Sex, eating, sleeping, moving about if you felt like moving about. To say that they're pleasurable is to point out what should be, to any reasonable person, an absolute minimal requirement, because, I hate to say it, perhaps we'll all bite our lips, but then perhaps some of you should bite your brain and go, yeah. It's considered one of the reasons that sex is so much fun. Consider one of the reasons that eating is so much fun. Consider one of the reasons that moving about, if you're in the mood to move about, is so much fun. Or if laying down, if falling down like a exhausted whale is what your want is temporarily to be. Think of how much fun it is. It is almost, maybe it is, incomparable, each of the three. So from one view you can see that all primary activities are pleasurable beyond really any discussion. Because anyone who has to discuss sex, anyone who, from a certain view, had to sit around with about sex, let's say, and discuss the relative possibilities, tried to debate, is sex fun? Such people, by the way, if you were just reasonable, you didn't ask me, but I would just advise that you look for somebody else, to play snooky with. Because if somebody's got to sit around and discuss, sex is as much fun as I think it is, or as much fun as some people say it is. I would suggest you be just as well to hang around the fruit stand and see if they got any copies of the swimsuit issue left. Or if somebody's sitting around trying to discuss, not dining now, but if somebody's actually trying to discuss or wants to debate with you the relative merits of eating. Now, you're dealing with somebody that, assuming your brother's still a chiropractic psychiatrist, you're to send him the business. You simply should see it is not open to debate. Nobody reasonable within the middle of life's bell curve has any reason whatsoever. It should never even cross their little, I think what they're pleased to call their minds. It shouldn't even cross their minds to have any question like, is sex fun? Now, we all know that there are, nowadays in the secondary world, people who do ask such, but then again, they've got to fill up the audience, I guess, of the Donahue and the Oprah shows with somebody. But there are people who seriously, and people that even have degrees and etc., sit around and discuss, is sex fun? You should see that over a wide range, outside the talk shows, outside a certain segment of the secondary world, the primary activities are not open to discussion with ordinary people. They don't even think to discuss, is sex fun? It never crossed their mind. Or is it fun to eat when you're hungry? My, is that a philosophy? It's just ridiculous. Tied to that, that's what I was trying to get you to see before we pressed on, is the fact that there is no question about primary activities, the absolute old, established, silent, minimally required, basic requirements to keep an individual and the race going, of sex, food, and shelter, and etc. There's no question about them being pleasurable, which, if you want to see it a certain way, is a kind, again, of a backflip of life to do, because were they not so pleasurable, you would have more people sitting around saying, well, I don't know, I've been having sex now for 22 years, and I think maybe I'll just give it up for 22. I've been eating quite well for the last 30 years. I think I'll stop for a while. It's just ridiculous. And besides being ridiculous, the little point, the pivot point before we go around the corner is still, even that, all of that, those ridiculous possibilities notwithstanding, the primary stuff is so much natural fun, it is so pleasurable, that no one even thinks about it. No one questions it. But now, consider, again, we're with the question of for what purpose a secondary world, besides it being open-ended and capable of mutations, change within one person's lifetime, whereas the primary is not, is also this. The primary world is responsible for having plans, because, I got to tell you, you got to have a plan. I was almost overcome by some of the past philosophical, if not sociological work of Dr. Sondheim and Larry Gelbart, but instead of Roman ideas having to do with domestic affairs, that is maids, I was suddenly thinking a plan, you got to have a plan. For those of you that don't remember it. Zero Mostel's, that was pretty obscure, wasn't it? Never mind. Well, I told you, I just thought about it. So. It was then a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. But instead of saying about a maid, you got to have a maid. I was going to point out that the secondary world requires that you got to have a plan, and for a very good reason. And as always, if you hear it, it has never been brought down to a verbal level in the three-dimensional world. Because without a plan, the primary activities are too short. They are too abrupt. They are too short-lived for expansion. So there's got to be a plan. That is, you have got to, for the secondary world, have an intellect that is capable not any longer of simply acting. Because without a secondary world, without the intellect, if we were going to be so capricious in our description, man, the organism, could still operate. He could still screw and eat and sleep and move about. He could act, but he could not think of acting. You have got to have plans to take up for the fact that at the secondary level, all of those activities are immediate and very short-termed, very short-lived. What the intellect does in the secondary world is it expands in a way that's not possible otherwise. It expands the too short time frame, the way in which the older primary activities operate. See if we can make it, if you got any doubts, real clear. Without a plan, for instance, what is referred to as romance, love. Without a plan, that would be back to simply momentary sex. And the secondary world needs more than that. And of course, momentary sex, I guess from a female view nowadays, I sort of hate to ponder it because the last figures, well, I'm just thinking, just in the secondary world, where they operate, Masters and Johnson or Kinsey, whatever the latest figures, it was something like the average man in the Western world. In the sexual act, I think the up-to-date figures was something like, I hate it. What was it, 95 seconds or something. I hate to give anybody the blues. Well, at any rate, being a man, I can vouch for this. Many times you could do that, were it not for the sake of good old baseball scores and counting the tiles. All right. That was not for a cheap laugh. I was trying to get you to see the immediate point. If we did not have the full concept of romance, which is a secondary concept, it is a kind of overlay. It is not stratified, of course, in that clear an instance, but it is a kind of overlay. It could not exist without, let's call sex, again, the primary basis of romance. But were it not for romance, you would be talking about humans, again, to be artificial, but in a way that does point to the reality of the evolution of man, the full-fledged organism. You would have humans rutting in the same way that animals do. And regardless of the fact that you hear, whatever they are, warthogs or mink that do it 4 or 5 hours, man would be back evidently on the basis of, I think, some of the some other creatures. At any rate, it'd be possible to actually live out the good old Alabama philosophical term of wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. It would just be you'd do it and it'd be over with. But notice, the secondary world could not have grown on that basis. You have got to have a plan. If you're going to be in love, if you're going to be romantically involved with somebody, you've got to have a plan. You have got to be thinking about sex, and I do not mean daydreaming. You have got to be having some sort of plan beyond the immediacy of the sex act. For instance, probably the first thing, if we're going to play caveman history, assume that somebody somewhere, taking a caveman at least symbolically, if not metaphorically, a caveman somewhere, and his nervous system begins to develop to the point that he begins to think. And let us say that he's thinking just after he got through, with his 95 seconds with the girl in the next cave. And he starts to think. All right, immediately, if this happens and the secondary world is beginning to come in to existence, he's got to have a plan. And I would suggest the first plan he'd have is, what's your phone number? That is, so he can find her the next time he wants sex. Because were it not for that, if you were just a hippo, you would do it, and assuming that hippos have sort of the same chauvinistic attitude as most human men do, the male hippo would do it and walk off. And next time he wanted to do it, I don't know when hippos do it, maybe once a year, men get all carried away, male hippos. Next year, he'd go looking again, driven instinctively. Now, you can call it pleasurable, but now let's watch enjoyable, because he's got no plan. If you were simply involved, if humans were simply involved with the primary activity of sex, there'd be no thought, there would be no plan. And so it starts out, I was suggesting to you, whether you follow it or not, that historically, if there was such a thing, that the first plan was for this caveman doing it with this cave woman, and as soon as they're through, his plan is, I'd like to know where to get hold of you next time I'm horny. And so he says, where do you live? What's your phone number? Then it progresses even into, I was hoping that was crude enough to get you started, it gets into areas then, let's assume that he does keep going back to see her. And then first thing you know, I think even with the cave folks, she ends up with one in the oven. So then he's got a little family, a little cave family. And then he's got to have plans like, well, now I can't just feed myself. Now I got all these little cave nippers. So I got to get more food. So he's got to have more and more plans about, well, I got to have more food. I can't just go wandering out every morning looking for a fig Newton tree so I can feed myself. I got to find food. I got to take it back to them. There has to be more and more plans. You follow? The secondary world is a world of plans. And it has specifically to do, you understand, the immediacy, the abruptness of primary activities, if indeed we could describe them, which I can do verbally, but if we could describe the primary world in operation, things would be too abrupt. And not just sex, it would be food, for instance. Let's forget about the caveman and his pregnant girlfriend now. The guy, the caveman, he goes out every morning, no thought going on. He goes out and he eats. He finds something to eat, and he eats what's before him. He eats to the point, and he gets up and he leaves, or he lays down and takes a nap. For the secondary world to take place, though, he has got to start making plans. That is, he eats, and then he thinks, how did I get here? There's some more bushes here, and I suddenly, now that I can think, I realize I get hungry like this every time the sun comes up. I'll come back here. Next time I'm hungry, instead of me just getting up and going and wandering around, I'll come back here. Or he makes a plan. Hey, I'll take some. I'm full. Well, what's going to stop me from putting some in my pocket and taking them back with me? The secondary world being absolutely based on the nervous system of man beginning to fire and operate at the level known as the intellect, is in charge of making plans which constructively, that is literally at the 3D level, expands the too short, too abrupt time frame in which primary activity take place, because people would simply engage in sex, and that's it, and they'd wander off, take a nap. They would eat what's before them, eat, and that's it. Get full, Just whatever's there, they just drop it and they walk off. Or they're trying to get out of the elements. They find a cave, they get inside, and they don't get wet. But then it quits raining, they wander off, and they forget where the cave was. To have a plan, though, the guy looks around and maybe even tries to chisel out a little sign saying, John's cave, Hubert's cave, do not trespass. Thus, if you can see it, that while all unplanned, intrinsic activities are noble, natural to the primary world, and while ordinary chit-chat talk, routine fears, regrets, dreams are natural to a secondary existence. To do whatever this is, a real revolutionist has got to have, somehow, has got to develop some kind of plans that go beyond that. Because it's not a matter of going back and cleaning up those plans. It's not a matter, as life lets it even seep out in a kind of contorted form with ordinary people. Everybody knows this, that believe that if there is some change to be made in life, which all ordinary people believe that they do it somewhere and that they should be making some change, notice the change is always on the basis, or the crudest, the most widespread still on this planet at this time, is down at the primary level. What seems to be the holds, what seems to be the attraction, what seems to be the main plan of all religions. What do they attack? Now, of course, the more up-to-date they are, the more widespread they are in the secondary world, the more things they attack. But what's the basis of the attack? Look back at the Old Testament, the Quran. Look back at the old Greek and Norse mythology. They start off attacking the primary. They're always trying to get some plan about sex. Don't do it. Don't do it on Tuesday. Don't do it with women or men who are not part of our religion. Or every time you do it, bring a priest a quarter. And if it's not that, they're saying, don't eat lettuce. Don't eat lettuce if it's been in the same icebox with buttermilk. Don't drink buttermilk on Saturday. And if it's not that, it's don't live in a certain place. Don't dress a certain way. Don't wear short skirts. Don't wear long hair. They start off on the primary. Then the more up-to-date it is, just like everything else in life, and this is no attack on religion because it's the same reflection in politics, education, all of the so-called institutions. But this is just the easiest to point out. It then gets into the secondary world, which is, of course, just a magnification of the primary, but gets into the secondary regarding how people behave in the areas that would seem to be not directly based on sex or security or the sustenance necessary just to keep the organism alive. But then it gets into things like, don't cheat your fellow man. Or don't cheat your fellow man if he's a member of our religion. Or don't defraud your fellow man, especially if he's poor. It just gets into the hobby areas, into the things that must be in the secondary world going on to keep people distracted while waiting in the big AQ, the arbitoire queue, while waiting there. And nowadays, all of one's time in the secondary world, the civilized world, in the city, all of your time is not taken up, I don't think most of you, with screwing, and it's certainly not taken up all the time. You may be working 2 or 3 jobs, but it's not because you have to, because it's not that you're out beating the bushes for berries and leftovers all day just so you can eat. And you're not out spending the time after you've spent X number of hours chasing down berries, trying to catch some rainwater. You do not spend the rest of the time then scurrying around trying to find a tree that has fallen over so that you can hide under it, or to find a cave that nobody's taken over. So when it comes to the primary activities, as far as your time standing in line for the slaughterhouse, it's almost nothing. You do not have to get out unless you're as ugly as people I don't want to discuss. You don't have to spend all that time in a singles bar. Sex is not that hard to find. Staying alive is not that hard to do anymore. And so you got to have something else to do in the line. That is the secondary world. You have got to be planning. You've got to be not just acting. You've got to be thinking of acting. And you have got to be involved with the kinds of activities that are simply a kind of reflection of the primary. All of them are enjoyable. It becomes a matter of degree, which is not of any great interest. You'll be able to do that on your own. It's not a matter that sex is more fun than secondary aspects of sex. In a sense, it should be, but that's not the point. Or it's not the point to say, well, I love to sit down and fool around with the guitar or my synthesizer. I love to try and sketch and paint. And is that really more fun than it is to eat when you're hungry? All of that's a waste of time. It will get you nowhere other than if you see a certain kind of nexus to all of this that is putting the dots together in the old stadium, being able to connect up all the players on the field. But it's not that one is better than the other. It is not in some way to go back to the primary world. It would not be of any benefit to someone attempting to do this to try and pursue any religion. It doesn't matter what religion. To try and in some way go back and to straighten up your primary interests and your primary activities. There is nothing to straighten up. Or to go back and think, well, it would help me. I engage in sex far too much. What I'll do is I'll find out what 3 different religions say about sex, and I'll add them together, and I'll divide by 3, and I'll go for that. There's nothing to be done about that worthwhile, just for an average, ordinary person to get interested in that. And there is nothing of any particular consequence to be said about your activities in the secondary world, your hobbies, the interests that would not be absolutely necessary to keep you alive. That is the primary world and the primary activities. So then the question is, I'm hoping that not all of you got lost when I started that sub-paragraph. It was that the plans that are ordinarily available, the kinds of activities, the pursuits that ordinary people do, that is the kind of pursuits that you would do left to your own devices if you had not fallen into the dirty clutches of having interest in this kind of stuff. That out there in the secondary and the primary world with everybody is this continuing feel that I should be doing something different, I should be changing. But the point is, once you see it, that there is nothing literally to be changed in the instinctive world. There's nothing to be changed in what you have been driven to do primarily and in the secondary fashion up till now. That's not the point. Except by all ordinary definitions, by everywhere that the ordinary intellect works, that's exactly the damn point. And what I've just said is silly as being charitable. It's just ridiculous. Because what else can you do if there's anything to change in life? What can you change other than change your life? Of course, the quick answer is you overlook the possibility of going somewhere else. There's a particular way that you would say that a real revolutionist, somebody trying to ignite their own nervous system in a different spot of the brain, is you have got to be able to some way go past the plans that would involve the past and the present and even what seems to be tomorrow. Because all of those, if we're still left with what we were discussing earlier, if it's a dog having to mark off a certain place, a dog even walking in a new area, smelling something he's never smelled, but it's still the question of, can you learn from that which you must do? Is it actually enjoyable being involved with the have-tos? If it is possible that through plans, which amounts to plans in reverse when you're talking about the past, regrets and guilt and etc., and I should have done, if the plans are in any way connected with the past, which may seem obvious to some of you right quick, that, yeah, well, forget that, because how can you have plans for the past anyway? We just don't have time to stop and go through that because ordinary people do. Then you say, well, you got to have some kind of plans for now. Okay. And then you have to say, well, wait a minute. Even if you're trying to dismiss plans for now, you got to have plans for the future. What is the future other than something to plan for? Yeah, you people will be able to figure that out by yourself. At least just in a wild moment, it should strike you some way. You've got to have plans that go beyond those 2 levels. And within those 2 levels is carried all aspects of the 3D world, including time. That if you got any plans that are tied to that, then they're not revolutionary plans. They have nothing to do with change because you cannot change. You're still dealing with the primary world, your primary activities, and you're still dealing with the secondary world. which only to ordinary intellects apparently has any freedom. It has the same kind of freedom of, boy, it's enjoyable to take my dog for a walk because he gets to go to new places and do what? Smell new smells. Mark off new places. That's something new. And that's new activities. All right, let's reconsider something we talked about a few nights ago. It's connected with this. Let me shift it slightly. That it is only with the primary world that men do complain. And the closer one is to a primary existence, not that this would be beneficial, and not that it's even possible to go backwards, but the closer one would be to a primary existence, the less there would be of complaints. An aborigine, in the full sense of the word, if there was still a real feral society living somewhere on this planet. And of course there is, just don't, wait till you get home before you look inside your own drawers. But if we were talking about out there in the movable state of a real feral society, and their people, places right now, relatively speaking, are uncivilized compared to people living in most of the United States, at least. For instance, they would not complain if they were starving to death. That is, the closer you are to being at the primary level, you can be starving to death, and they don't seem to think of complaining. They could be hornying to death, and nobody complains. Well, unless they were starving. And that may at first strike an ordinary intellect, if an ordinary intellect was watching this, hearing this, that, wait a minute, that can't be true. It is absolutely true. There's just no absolute example possible out there today. And if there was, I'm sure an ordinary intellect could see it, because they could still, life would have the ordinary intellect try to explain it away. But the closer you would be to a primary existence, to such things as eating, not dining, but eating. And then you had the negative aspect of eating, that you had a group here, several people, and they're almost, relatively speaking, they're almost living at a primary level. They can be starving, literally starving. They're about to die in front of your eyes if you woke up, and they don't complain. Of course, some of you should be able to make your own note that only man complains anyway, period. But at any rate, based upon what I was trying to get you to gaze toward, it is only as a person, a nervous system, only as a group begins to approach the primary world that complaining begins. If there was any justice in the world, the stands, people would be fleeing from the stands now. They'd be throwing down their hot dogs and beer, and they'd ignore what happened in last night's All-Star game, and I'd simply take a bow and we'd stop for the evening. To realize, because complain, that's just a word, it's somewhere else, that it is only as the secondary world begins to come into existence in you and out there, but in you, it is only then, and take complain as being a symbol. It is only then that people begin to complain. That is, from one very real view, it's only as things begin to get better. Well, would you like to be living at the primary level? No, I'll assume not, unless you're naturally, if you're from Alabama already. All right, Albania. Would you like to live at that level? And we'll assume that the answer for civilized, up-to-date, sophisticated people will be, well, no. But it is literally a fair representation that you should be able to see that at a primary level, the more you relatively approach that kind of level, the less you would complain. In other words, the worse things were, from a more civilized view. If we could now suddenly throw you, say, in the outback of Australia, and got you so disoriented it took you weeks or months to ever just accidentally stumble back to civilization, and just dropped you there, assuming you didn't die, that you survived a while. And there you are. I'm talking about you're dropped in the middle of nowhere, and you have immediately got to start looking for food, a place to get out of the rain, the lightning, the cold winds. You would not complain. Oh, I'll give you maybe a day or so that you might mumble to yourself and bitch. And, whose idea was this? Wait till I get my hands on them. But I assure you, within a reasonable length of time, 48 hours or so, if we could hide up in the clouds and become invisible, there'd be no more complaints. You'd very shortly stop complaining here, and you would, it might take a little more than 48 hours, but not much more, you would soon quit complaining here. You would. And surely all of you can feel that in your own nervous system. So then, let's say that would be a worse condition in which to live. But notice, if that be true, which from a three-dimensional view it is true, you go from there to being civilized, having a fairly cushy job, maybe getting a little stiffing every now and then from the government. Everything's pretty easy. You don't have to kill yourself. So things, as they get better, it is only then that men do complain. It would be only after this fictitious Aborigine tribe that, let us say, that we plucked them from wherever they were and we brought them sort of swiftly into the 20th century. And when we met them, there they were, fairly hungry, no good clothes, never even heard of Sony or Walkman or nothing. And we bring them in, and they don't complain. You meet them and you try to talk to them. Let's say that we could in some way communicate fairly quickly and ask them what they eat, and it turns out that they are indeed eating asphalt, like we talked about. I don't know how they found it out there, but they're sucking bark. And half the tribe, every time it rains, they get drowned. They get chills and they get bad colds. But we find out they do not complain. I mean, if we ask them, like, what happens when it rains? We get wet. And what happens when there's no food? People die. And you wait like for the rest of it, and they don't complain. But let us say within a short period of time, we bring them into the 20th century, we give them the technology. You do understand this, this probably get a laugh, but this is it. In a few weeks, you bring them in to the modern age. You run out some electricity, and you bring in 2 or 3 weeks, you go back, and those same people, as soon as you walk back in, somebody's going to say, these TV sets, we'd like some with bigger screens. Very short period of time. And that's not a joke, although it's funny, it's not a joke. Because you can only begin to complain as the intellect begins to operate, and there begins to be plans, and there is a kind of open-endedness, not just in life, because there's still limits in the 3D world of what's going to happen, such as you're not going to grow a new eye in the middle of your forehead or a new arm so that you could get a real bonus for signing up with the Mets. But within the limits of the secondary world, this kind of expansion is tied to complaining, which is just a word. But it represents something quite real. That's why I went with a little joke. Although it's not a joke of, within several weeks, these non-complaining, uncivilized people that you bring up to date within several weeks, that you were there, showed them the first TV set, and imagine how they felt. And you had to go back home. A few days, by the time you got back, somebody would be saying, probably all of them, hey, we heard that they make sets with screens a lot bigger than this. Where are they? To say it's complaining, do you also see that it is a kind of external manifestation of the internal itch to change? Because at least you take it as being simply a pejorative, sarcastic joke about the nature of social evolution, that people are never satisfied and all that kind of stuff. Look at it another way, that in the secondary world, no one is ever satisfied. And if there was not that kind of complaining, we would not have electricity. We would not have clothes that you didn't have to make out of asphalt or bark. We would not have TVs. We would not have the modern world. You wouldn't have any sort of world beyond the primary world, which, remember where we started, is pleasurable enough. You cannot knock if you're sane. If you're just the bourgeoisie of man within life's body, you cannot complain and knock sex, food when you're hungry, rest when you're tired, movement when you're getting stiff. Nobody can knock that. But were it not for complaining, that's all we'd be doing. And that's obviously not sufficient for life. There would be no secondary world were it not for complaining. Or if in some way life had opened up the possibility of, all right, all of you people down there, all of you aborigine, feral, uncivilized folks, and even those of you in France, they always want me to throw that in. It's like life would say, all right, you got a chance here, go ahead and start a secondary world. And if it didn't strike anybody, it was all these, now let's say that all of us, all of humanity was an uncivilized tribe sitting around. Some of us starving, some of us drowning, some of us can't find mates, some of us can't even find our private parts to engage in sex. And we're all sitting there, and life in some way opens up the possibility of, okay, like open up the Oklahoma Territory, to go out and homestead new intellectual areas. Go out and start a secondary world. All right, if this tribe of humanity, all of us, if it hadn't struck somebody to start complaining, nothing would have happened. It'd be like life blew the whistle and told all the Sooners and everybody, all right, go out there and pick out your little acreage. And everybody just sat there. And it's then like life thought, well, I made a mistake. The people are not adventurers, or life wandered off and forgot about it. What it took was, from one view, I could describe it other ways, and you should be able to see it, but from one view, what it took was some of the people had to begin to complain. That is, at first they're given a chance, is what it amounts to. Of course, I am really playing with three-dimensional reality, but it would be like life said, all right, all of you uncomplaining, somewhat starving, obviously ill-dressed, ill-kempt people, I'm giving you the chance to start to do something that I have not given jackals and warthogs and hippos the opportunity to do. So, go ahead and start a kind of secondary world going on in the midst of this. And then life said, I got to go somewhere, and wandered off, and I'll be back. And if everybody kept sitting there, all of us, all of our progenitors, and they sit there. Some of us still starving, some of us still drowning by staring up at the weather, some of us wandering out and hugging trees when lightning is popping all around. Same stuff going on, but it's like we had a chance to create something new. And it seemed at first, let us say, that some of us went, God, what a break. What a nice guy life is. That he said that we can do something that other creatures can't do. That in some way we can go do something new. That still wouldn't have got it started. Then some of us would have had to go, well, geez, that's a lot of effort. In other words, somebody would have had to start complaining as soon as you realize, well, wait, here's a chance for something good. That is, you give them TVs and come back 2 weeks later, and they say, hey, this stuff's in black and white. We heard they make color TVs. What are you trying to do to us? It's the same kind of thing. Except the scenario I'm painting for you didn't even go that far. Life just said, here's a chance, start a whole new world for me. Start another level of existence. And let us say that a large segment of humanity went, wow, God, what a break. Boy, I'm really glad now I am a human as opposed to being a copperback. And life wandered off. Like, well, now you guys get going. I'll be back. Still nothing would have happened if we had just all been sitting there and went, wow, how great. Geez, how do we deserve this? Oh, boy. Aren't the giraffes going to envy us? Oh, boy, this is stopping us now. This is great. Nothing would have happened. Somebody would have had to go, great schmate, wait a minute. You know what this means? Wait a minute, I don't like this. Hey, everything was all right. What does it mean go out and start something new? Well, I want new. And then some more went, wait a minute, Hubert's right. What the hell is, what's he trying to do to us? Everything was fine. What was life want out of us? Hippos are bigger. When you pick on them? Cheetahs run faster. What else I want to do? It's all I can do to get by now. Then, the secondary world began to blossom. Then progress started. Then the secondary evolution started. The world that is singular to man. Well, aren't you glad we took a little longer interlude, because now I think some of you have your own grasp of it. But even after if you can catch a glimpse yourself, even after seeing that complaining is a natural, necessary part of life's general health, even while you can see that, then you get to realize somehow that beyond the complaining, which is a natural, pleasurable part of the primary world, it is a noble, native part of the secondary world. There is got to be the possibility of a kind of parallel life that's got plans that are not based on any complaints. That the ideas that are possible do not need an opposing team to show up in your stadium to have to prop you up, like the diagram we were drawing last time. To bring what seems to be your own thought, your own secondary world, which now becomes, as I was trying to infer by saying, a kind of parallel life, becomes something beyond both the primary and the secondary. It's not a matter of better, and it's not that it in some way now, well, I'll straighten out those other two. They're not crooked. But it has got to be something going on. It would be, you might say, like an alien, like a foreigner who had slipped in without a green card, without governmental sanction, and he's living right there in the middle of the city. Or if you want it even more up to date, an alien from another place, like the good old 50s movies, shows up here in town, and just immediately through the wiles of his own intellect, he adopts the look of everybody else and just walks right in. Similar. Because you can't leave the city. If you even tried, if it was possible, wouldn't be no profit there. Because the city hadn't done you in, the secondary world hadn't done you in, the primary world certainly hadn't done you in. And it's that you can still live there. And you're living in the city, you're going along with primary activities, that is, you've got to be eating, you've got to be staying sheltered. And it's not my business, but I would hope that you still enjoy a little, little of the other stuff. You got to do that. And if you're living in modern times, if you're living here in civilization, then to some degree you're involved with the secondary world. You've got some kind of interest, some kind of hobbies. So you're doing something at that level. And it's not that any of it per se is incorrect. But all of it is tied to a form of complaining once it reaches those two levels, or you wouldn't even have the second level operating. And so although you have got the noble, natural pleasures and necessities of a primary existence, and the ones nowadays, which is a kind of secondary, primary requirement of everything it takes to be civilized, this operating, which is all it takes. Once you've got that operating, there has got to be, if you're going to do something else, a kind of parallel secret existence, another life. It is plans without complaining. It is plans, it is playing a game, to go back to the baseball symbolism, or any kind of sports. It is to be able to play a game whereas it's not required that you have an opposing team, which takes away all matter of complaint, and vice versa. It absolutely refutes any idea that you are still pursuing in some specific, pristine manner any primary or secondary activity, which I don't guess is necessary anymore, but again is why, if you tried to be as specific as possible, that this kind of stuff is at least tricky to try and describe. All you can do is draw parallels, present metaphors, sketch out symbolisms, because it's not to redo, it is not to take remedial action as the religions would have it, as all sorts of even nowadays psychological activities and treatments would have it. It's to go back and in some way to remodel the old stadium, in some way to directly interfere with primary activities, which seems to be just the heart of What ordinary people want to do? Well, my problem is sexual. I either need some kind of treatment or I need to get myself on Geraldo's show so I can talk about it. Or people think, well, my problem is my diet. But sex is a great one now. The whole psychological life of man. That is my problem. That is the widespread kind of religious, neo-religious belief in civilized cities of our day and time. It's not right, it's not wrong. It's the way things are. But they are attacking that, as life always has men doing on the wide scale. They're attacking that which is so far in the past, it is so deep-rooted, that they are engaged in busy work. They're engaged in fool's errands, but it creates energy and it continues to expand the intellectual life. It continues to expand the secondary world of man while not doing life any damage. It's as though man is life's Stillman's water diet. That is man's secondary activity. The good old water diet symbolism, I still fear that some of you don't follow it. When it was popular there for a few hours or months, was to drink so much water, the theory, of course, being that would fill you up and to keep you from eating, which it will not. I mean, there's such a thing that Dr. Stillman seemed to have gone to some medical school that had not discovered the operations of the kidneys. I'm sure he did. I hope the good doctor doesn't sue me if he sees. The point being, if you recall, what I was trying to get you to see is the water diet. It is just inconvenient enough that it gives the impression that you're doing something. You have to keep drinking 17 glasses of water a day and then have to go to the bathroom every 10 minutes. That you got the feeling. And it got nothing to do with losing weight. It will not help. Unless you're going to talk about the placebo effect, and you people are supposed to be good enough to know that all the placebo effects, so don't fall back on that. It is that per se, that is literally at a primary level, which is what they were saying this was working at. That just by doing this, it would fill you up, and therefore you wouldn't eat and you'd lose weight. And it's not true. But it was popular because it gave the impression, just as I also suggested, that many people at the secondary level in the city, that many people's lives is like an exaggeration, expansion of the Stillman water diet, that for 70 years you're doing something. That is, standing in line, kicking around, pursuing secondary activities and complaining, doing as you're supposed to. It's like 68 or 70 years of being on the Stillman diet. Your life doesn't really help you, it doesn't really hurt you, but it's just inconvenient enough that just stumbling through it, right when you die, you feel like, well, I've done something. Even if somebody looks down or they've been on the Stillman diet for 2 or 3 years, and some aunt comes in from out of town and says, I hate to tell you this, but I'm not sure you actually lost any weight. And the feeling would have to be something like, well, no, I'm not going to discuss the details, but by God, hey, I've done something. That is, if somebody for 2 years had faithfully been on the Stillman diet, there's no doubt they would feel like I've done something. That at least wore out the linoleum going to the bathroom. It's simply that you have been inconvenienced enough, you have done that which you wouldn't think you would ordinarily do, and so there's got to be a payoff. And so people end up, so they got a few minutes and they're fairly sane just before they die, and it's kind of that feeling like, well, life's been kind of like the Stillman diet. I just wander here and back and forth. And, it's kind of, sometimes there's a pain, sometimes it's all right, but the general thing is, well, 70 years I've just been inconvenienced, irritated just enough that, it's got to amount to something. It's like the Stillman diet. It is like what I was trying to draw your attention to now. It is like all of the plans, all of the thinking of acting that the intellect does, that the human nervous system does now for life. It is almost from another level as though life could look at man at the secondary level, not the primary level, because man is not capable of mutating on his own, which of course would be detrimental not only to himself but to life. But at the secondary level, it is almost as though life could look at man as being its own Stillman diet. Once I started off on that and knew what I was going to say, I almost tried to go ahead and lose you 30 seconds ago instead of coming back to that, because I was afraid too many of you would go. It was fun, and I thought it meant something up until then. Take that as extreme symbolism, because man is obviously not an irritation to life, or he hasn't been yet. He hasn't been that we know of, that even you can know of. He hasn't been for easily 6,000 or 7,000 years. Easily, secondarily speaking. So up until now, you're safe. That's not even what I was inferring. But I was trying to get you to see that from a secondary view, if you could take a bigger view, if right now you could try and play life, then you could say, well, hey, man, at the very most, or at the very least, according to which end you can get to look, you could say, hey, I see what you mean. We could say that man was almost the water diet. Don't worry about it. Next time I start it, I'll get everybody lost enough, and then I just won't bring back up the... Well, I wanted to hit one more thing, but we are... Now what the hell? What's 20 minutes compared to 6 minutes? All right, next paragraph. I was going to close out and try to get you to see it's also tied to this, but you can label... The new paragraph is this: is only the most menial jobs require a uniform. It is symbolism at its widest because it is as true as it can be out there. If you don't believe it, go apply for a job at Burger King or somewhere else. If you want to talk about trivial, menial work, all you got to do is remember, it is the most menial work that requires a uniform. Symbolism, being a step sideways, if not better than metaphor, remember, symbolism means what it means, and it means something else. Because it is true. Drive past McDonald's, drive past an army base, drive past a church. It is true. If you're wearing a uniform, you can count on this. The job is involved with grunt work, and it's going to be minimally waged. It's going to be the best you get. But now, for instance, let's go into what symbolism is. For instance, outside the wonderful world of fast foods and the military and our great religious institutions, for instance, to get to an individual level, the real kind of menial, trivial work is in proclaiming, and thus adopting a uniform, hey, yes, I'm Jewish. Hey, I'm Italian. Hey, I'm an honest guy. Hey, I've had it hard. It's a uniform. If you will identify yourself, there is no escaping this. You are doing grunt work. You are in minimally waged labor. If you will say it, yes, I'm Irish. Yes, I believe that. I'm a liberal. I'm a conservative. Hey, wait a minute. I'm an American. Hey, wait a minute. I'm a man. I'm talking about a real man. You have taken a uniform. You are supposed to. That is a part of the continuing identification of the transfers of energy in life. And we certainly don't have time to give you any kind of backhand, but you can see on your own the way psychology and sociology and just common sense pictures a kind of social strata. And that people do dress, not just priests, not just workers in fast food restaurants, but people the way they dress. A secondary aspect of the sustenance of staying alive. The kind of civilized ways people dress, jewelry, the way you do your hair. It's not a knock on any of that, because that's quite acceptable secondary hobbies. It's no worse than playing with yourself or playing the accordion. Well, we don't have time to go into that either. Maybe I misspoke. But all of that is a form of uniform, and the ordinary sociological, psychological attempts to analyze that is a hobby. I'm trying to get you to see that there is absolute energy behind it. And the energy takes on its form as a uniform, but not just this of how you're dressed. It is the uniform that covers the energy of the mind, of the intellect, and it's the words. The words such as, well, yes, I'm a Presbyterian. Well, yes, I'm French. Hey, I have been an attorney for 20 years. It is all a uniform. And I'll repeat again, because there's no escaping this. It is only the most menial, trivial, low-paying jobs require a uniform. It is true out there, which is meaningless, unless you're tied absolutely to the secondary world, but it is internally. And you can say, take it a little further, to somebody attempting to do this, a real revolutionist, the most demeaning, the most meaningless, the most unprofitable jobs with a uniform for somebody attempting to be a revolutionist, somebody attempting to subvert their own intellect. The most demeaning jobs is to be somebody else's hometown, to be somebody else's home team. Oh, I know if we were ordinary, you'd think, well, I am my own home team. Right, yeah. I mean, it's just good we don't have time to decide, when is it that you built Wrigley Field? Let's assume yours is Wrigley Field. And the question is, or the answer is, well, I don't know, it was like I was born, and I wandered out of a silent cave, I wandered out of a primary world, and suddenly there I am, and I'm in Wrigley Stadium. Yeah, but we can't push that, because then, as dirty as some people are, somebody'd say, wait a minute, if you can answer that question that way and you're satisfied, then we got to ask this. We hadn't done it all week. What are you going to say next? I mean, everybody can build their own Yankee Stadium, their own Wrigley Field. If they can do that, they can tell you what they're going to say next, right? Let's change the subject. Okay. That would be being somebody else's home team, having hometown sentiments. If that's all you are, if that's the only plans you're making, you're taking you as being you, and you're not involved in any sort of revolution. That is the most demeaning job with a uniform. You're repeating, you're thinking other people's thoughts. You're engaging only in the kind of intellectual games that do require an opposing team. You were born into a league that as all good leagues are, anything that operates institutionally at the city level, you've been born into something that the rules are already established. Except nobody notices it. You're not supposed to notice it. That's just the way things are. But if you can operate a kind of parallel mode outside the primary and the secondary, then you're not left with having to be in a uniform. That is, you're not left with having to think the only things that the ordinary intellect can think that makes it think. That is, it can't think without a uniform. It cannot think unless an opposing team comes on the field. It cannot think unless there's a boundary between what it thinks and what it does not think. And to do that, it's got to be planning. It's got to be on the primary level. It's got to be at the secondary level. And to do it, it's got to have opposition. And to have opposition, you can't even have any opposing team unless you've got a hometown, unless you are a hometown team. Because even if opposition's out there, the A's are flying around looking for you. They were booked to play you this weekend. And here it is, they're flying around, and they're supposed to be playing you. And you don't exist. You don't have a hometown. They can't fly. They're going to be like an aerial flying Dutchman, going forever, looking, where is so-and-so? We can't go on with the rest of the schedule. They can't finish out the 1990 season. 20 years from now, they're still flying, all with beards, looking for you. You have got to have a hometown. That is, you got to have a uniform. You got to holler out, hey, here I am, I'm Detroit. Hey, down here, I'm Detroit. I'm an Irish Catholic. I'm a Syrian Muslim. I'm down here. I'm an honest guy. I'm a woman that's semi-attractive, but I've had a hard time. Then the plane can land. Then the opposing team, you're in your stadium, then they can announce visiting team. And sure enough, they're always there. Always there. They prop up what you think. Or else it'd be laying out there in the grass out in the outfield, and you'd never see it. There would not be enough dimensions to make your intellect come alive. I guess we're completely out of tape. Well, then I'll close, since we're, I guess, closed already. But I was going to close by saying, don't be merely instinctive once you understand what it means.